they have had sexual abuse of some form taking place in their life. You have to say, really? A 12-year-old, a 6th or 7th grader that wants to go out and have sex 30 times a night with men in their 30s, 40s, and 50s? Because they have become so programmed to think, this is who you are, this is what you were made for, this is what you're supposed to do. Why does it matter if it's a homeless child? Well, because a homeless child has a couple things can happen to them. 48 hours on the street, a third of them will be caught up in the sex trade.
Welcome to Pure Passion. My name is Stacia Freeman. One of the things that has held the church back from accomplishing all that God wants is the division and separation between various local churches and denominations. Despite our Lord's prayer in John chapter 17 that we be one as He and the Father are one, for the most part, that design has eluded us for the past 2,000 years. Issues like abortion, homosexuality, and sex trafficking, however, have created a bridge that is finally bringing us together. One such example is a ministry in Atlanta called Street Grace, a coalition of churches and ministries that have united to combat sex trafficking in a city known to have one of the highest incidences of trafficking in America. Let's take a good look at what God can do when His body unites to serve those who are lost.
In 2005, Mary Shirley Franklin issued a report called Hidden in Plain View. And the report talked about 3 corners that were particularly problematic. One of those corners was in the heart of downtown. One of those corners was in the heart of Buckhead, Piedmont Road, and Farr Road. But the corner that most got my attention and the attention of our congregation was our own corner, North Avenue and Peachtree Street.
8 churches got together and said, what is the need in Atlanta and where do the churches fit into this?
And the end of that process was the formation of a network of congregations throughout the metro Atlanta area called Street Grace.
There's a grand partnership going on in the life of Atlanta right now, and this has become a focal point for us all. We as a church at Perimeter have found this to be something that we're diving into full board because we believe it's such a critical need.
We're an alliance of churches dedicated to stopping the rape of children for profit in our city and stopping the rape of children for profit across this nation.
It's a moral evil, it's a moral cancer in the midst of a great city, and it's something that we as a faith community need to address.
Awareness and advocacy. Part of awareness is what we're doing now. You listening to this and finding out what's going on here is part of awareness, and our goal is to have 100,000 people aware by the end of 2010. Advocacy means that I have spent more time at the Capitol than I ever plan on spending in my entire life, but there were major changes that needed to start there. Church mobilization. It was, the church has come late to this issue. And what we're trying to do is not just raise the awareness of the churches, but to get the people in those churches mobilized to take some action. When this first came about, one of the things that was realized is that, churches would find out about it, or anybody would find out about it, and they'd go, well, gosh, that's terrible, but there was nothing for them to do. So part of what we're doing is we're mobilizing them to take real action to make change on this issue. The third is prayer. We understand that we're not in charge of this, that we are in charge of putting one foot in front of the other and doing what we're supposed to do on a day-to-day basis. But the entity that's in charge of this is God. And if we do what we're supposed to do, then He can make all the changes that are necessary. And all of that so all of our actions have to be undergirded with prayer. And our goal is to have 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week prayer. Our fourth initiative is mentoring at-risk children and supporting at-risk neighborhoods. We know that if all we do is rescue these girls and we don't prevent children from entering into it in the first place, that will increase the numbers of children affected. And the last initiative is the services for rescued children, places where they can go in for residential care, where their mental, physical, and spiritual needs can be met, where they can be restored to a healthy life and to wholeness. Street Grace's role in this issue is as a supporting organization. And by that, I mean that we partner with other organizations who are doing good in this area.
To help channel resources, the enormous resources of the faith community in Atlanta toward this issue in a way that will really make a difference so that we can end this evil in our midst.
A lot of the children are runaways. They have left an abusive home situation, and a lot of times that home situation is one where there's a lot of childhood sexual abuse. If you look at the statistics of what happens to the girls, about 70 to 90% of them will tell you that at some point in their life they have had sexual abuse of some form taking place in their life. And that can be through either a family member, close family friend. We talk a lot about stranger danger, but I think we need to kind of shift that conversation and talk about close family or even family members and help our children understand what the safety barriers are. And so what that does is it breaks down that child's barrier. There can be alcoholism, there can be poverty, there can be drug addiction. Sometimes it can be lack of education. You can have certain feeding factors that make a child more at risk. It doesn't mean that if they have all of those things going on that this is going to happen to them, because you can also have children that come from affluent homes that get swept up in this. They have, I call it the gadgets. They have the web cameras on their computers. They get into the chat rooms. They have maybe unsupervised lifestyles. They're given a lot of things, and so they have access to situations that maybe they shouldn't have at an early age. So vulnerability can look like two different ways. But the majority of these children are runaways. And so we have to understand that why does a child run? They're running from something that is so bad that running to the streets actually looks better. And then when they're actually out on the streets, we know that about a third of these children will get caught up into the sex trade within the first 48 hours. And that can be from somebody just coming up to them, offering them a meal, listening to them as they pour out their heart as to who they are. It can play out so many different scenarios that, I could probably sit here and tell you story after story for hours. But it's someone that looks at that child and sees that they're vulnerable, and then they prey upon their weaknesses. They can offer them a home, a place to stay, and then they can play that boyfriend role. Or they could play that boyfriend role even when that child is still going to school. One of the girls that we know now that is an adult survivor here in the Atlanta area would tell you that her story was being a child that was a throwaway, that basically wasn't wanted. She was sexually abused from the age of 2 on, and then eventually was thrown away and found herself out on the streets at about 12, 13, 14 years old. And she'll tell you that some nights she was so cold, she didn't know if she'd wake up the next morning because it was that cold outside. She didn't know if she would freeze to death. And she would go sometimes 2 or 3 days without food. And so for most of us, we can't even wrap our mind around that, because if we miss a meal, it's kind of unthinkable. And we can just go to our pantry and grab something. But she was so hungry. She ended up at one point having a child, and I'm not quite sure of the exact situation how she lost custody of the child, but the child's father ended up having custody. She met a friend of hers, called up a friend of hers, and went to visit her friend who lived at home with both parents, and asked her friend if she could stay there, and the friend said no, but the friend introduced her to a man who ended up being a pimp. She didn't know that at the time, but he was a much older man in his 40s or 50s, I think, and she was about 16 at the time. And as she poured out her heart to him, he just listened very patiently and very kindly, and at that point, he preyed on every weakness that she had, and he bought her a meal and ended up taking her down to a club where he convinced her to get up on stage and strip, and then she turned all the money over to him because when he told her to, she thought that's what she was supposed to do. She didn't know if he was keeping it for her or what was going on, but she did what he said. And then later on, about a day or two later, he got her some nice clothes and put her out on the street and reminded her that he knew where that child was, and if she didn't come home with the money that he'd assigned her to come home with, which was her quota, he would kill her. She ended up being in the prostitution life for a very long time. Fortunately, the man was arrested through a pimping bust here in Atlanta. He's now serving time in prison. She is now a survivor, and she actually goes out and helps speak on this issue to help other people understand what happened to her so that they can help put safety guards back around their own children and other kids won't get caught up in this. We have a culture that has, number one, kind of turned a blind eye to it. They have thought, first of all, that these were children that were bad kids and that they must be out there wanting to do this. They haven't understood what has happened behind the scenes in the life of a child to get them out there. They have thought, well, this is a 12-year-old that's making a conscious choice to go out there and prostitute herself. And so when you sit down and really think about it, you have to say, really? A 12-year-old, a 6th or 7th grader that wants to go out and have sex 30 times a night with men in their 30s, 40s, and 50s? How did that 12-year-old get to the hotel? How did that 12-year-old book a hotel room? And so people don't kind of take the issue to its logical conclusion, first of all. We also have a culture that glamorizes youth. That's, I think, one of the problems. You look at some of the magazine ads, you look at some of the things that children, not to sound prudish, but some of the things that children will wear. We had one company that was marketing push-up bikinis to children that were 7. Pornography is one thing that also leads into this too. We know it's a slippery slope. What you see doesn't satisfy, so you have to go see it live. And then what is live doesn't satisfy, so you have to go then act out upon what you see. Pornography, when I was a kid, is not like it is now. What we thought back when I was a kid that seemed just so wild now would be considered so tame. It's very, very different. People don't understand that that industry in and of itself is all cut and paste. And so what you see on the screen is not even reality as to what's going on. So there are so many different feeding factors in on this. And children that are caught up in this are being commodified. It is actually a business. We have to understand that there are people behind the scenes that are running this as a business. It's a business of demand and a business of supply. So truly getting to the demand side of the business and cutting off that demand with our young boys now would make the difference in the future, and getting to the fathers also now and anyone that is buying. And there can be women that are caught up in this too. So we don't want to make the presumption and make men feel like it's all their fault, because it's not. There are women that are buyers just as much as there are wonderful men that would never consider doing this. The girl that I was talking about previously, well, she was arrested. She ended up doing some time in prison. And part of her story is that for her, it was being in a prison cell one night, and she'd actually grown up going to church. And so for her, it was being in prison one night and realizing, as she prayed to God saying, help me, that he reached down in her dream, she said, and he couldn't help her because her heart, she said, was so much of a heart of stone. But in her dream, Jesus reached down and grabbed her heart and took out this hard heart of stone, and then reached into himself and pulled out a heart of flesh and put it into her. And so in her dream that night, she said she realized that she had to change completely and let go of everything. It's a hard process for girls when they get into this lifestyle, because they have become so programmed to think, this is who you are, this is what you were made for, this is what you're supposed to do. And they have been beaten down day in, day in, day in by their pimp and by their predator, by their exploiter, that this is all that they're capable of, this is all that they're good for. And so there's a whole process for them when they come back out that it's very hard to come back out. The number one way that a lot of girls get out of this lifestyle is through suicide or death. Very few come back out of it alive. We have one of our community partners that we work with called Back to the Streets Ministry here in Atlanta. And it is a man who used to be a pimp that is now going back to the streets because he's totally sold out for Jesus to rescue those who live in the margins. And he will tell you that he was raised by a single parent mom, 3 older sisters, but the men that poured into his life were drug dealers, gang members, and other pimps on the street. And so for him, he modeled what he saw. He thought that's what a real man should be. And so when he was 16, he had a 14-year-old girlfriend, and he did what's called a flip. He pimped her out. And for him, that started a lifetime of pimping out women. He did not pimp out children, but he pimped out other women. And he ran women up and down the East Coast and back and forth the United States. And for him, the only thing that truly changed his life, I think, was when he had a gospel intervention and someone took the time to share the gospel with him. He's now married to someone who used to be one of his girls. She too is sold out for Jesus. And they go back to the streets and reach out to people whose lives are changed. But in the pimping structure, there's actually a hierarchy. They have a system that is set up where they have a bottom girl they call it wife-in-laws, but they have a bottom girl who is kind of the one that goes out, collects the money, put the girls off the streets. And so she's kind of in an elevated position of authority over the rest of the girls, even though she's still in bondage, so to speak. But she kind of is has a little bit more power than the rest of the girls, a little bit more prestige than the rest of the girls. Street grace works mainly in 3 areas: awareness, prevention, and then restoration. And we undergird all of this through a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week prayer network. What we've realized is that there are still a lot of people here in the Atlanta area, and really even around the United States, that they don't understand that this is taking place in our own backyard with our own domestic children. And so when we start talking with them about children being commercially exploited, one of the first things they'll say is, well, you mean the girls overseas? And so, of course, we say, well, yes, it does happen overseas, but we're talking about our own domestic American born and bred children. So what we do, first of all, is we raise awareness about this taking place here. But we want them to be aware of it and then have something to do to work preventatively in this particular arena. Because we believe that prevention is going to be the key to it being solved. Ideally, if we just start rescuing girls in off the street, these guys have girls that they'll just go out and recruit and replace them. If you take 2 off the street, they'll put 3 back on the street. To them, girls are a dime a dozen, and they will find them. So we have to prevent this from happening in the first place. And prevention is a very multifaceted issue. It's prevention for parents, first of all, to understand how to prevent childhood sexual abuse, because 70 to 90% of the girls will tell you that they have been sexually molested or abused in some sort. So first of all, if you can help the church at large and society at large understand how to identify and prevent this from happening, that's going to cut into this issue. It's going to cut into the grooming technique that's used on children to take place. That someone will understand 14-year-old girl, 25-year-old boyfriend, not a good idea. So they can start to understand if someone is having inappropriate conversations with a child around this particular issue, to start breaking down those barriers, what they need to do. So we want churches to rise up, first of all, and get trained. They should have their staffs trained. They should have their children's workers trained. They should just get their congregation open up trainings to host so that their congregation can get trained if they want to. School systems should get trained on childhood sexual abuse prevention. Citizens that care should get trained on childhood sexual abuse prevention. So that's one of the first things we want to do. But then we've gone out also as an organization, and we have found nonprofits that are working with children that are at risk in the community and that have said they need help. They want Street Grace to help funnel volunteers towards them. And these are organizations that have mentoring needs, they have tutoring needs, they might be working with children in the foster care system, they might be working with children that are homeless or children whose parents or parent are incarcerated. Because all of these dots start to connect. And you start to look at all these things and say, well, why does it matter if it's a homeless child? Well, because a homeless child has a couple things can happen to them. 48 hours on the street, a third of them will be caught up in the sex trade. Homeless children get put into situations that are unhealthy. They can be forced into survival sex. Survival sex then can lead to someone saying, I'll take care of you, I'll look out for you, I'll be the person that you turn your money over to, and then they get caught up into all of this. So we want to keep children from falling into those cracks. Foster children, the church needs to rise up and help with foster children. If every church, from what I've been told, if every church in the United States would really work on adopting out of the foster care system, we might not have any foster care children. And so there are organizations out there like Faith Bridge Foster Care who's working to help churches organize and create a system of structure to support families that are adopting out of foster care. A lot of people would tell you they've been burnt out by working with foster care children because it's straining, it's demanding. But they've created kind of a module around the family unit so that they can bring tutoring services in, they can bring meals in for the family, they can give respite care for the family. And all of this is background checked for that family, and Faith Bridge works with the church. So it's a fabulous system that's set up. Organizations such as like a Jars of Clay here in Atlanta, they're in a gang-ridden territory. They have children that have sometimes failed their classes 2 or 3 times. Well, if they drop out of school, who's going to pick them up? A gang, very easily. The streets don't have anything to offer kids. But if they get swept up into gang activity, gangs are now really getting into the selling of children. It's a lot more lucrative than selling guns or drugs. You sell a gun, you sell a drug, it's gone. But if you have a human being that you can sell that human being multiple times a night, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and you can make a lot of money, all tax-free. So we have to help with the children to keep them on track academically, to build up that self-esteem, to build up their confidence, let them know that ideally they have in them to be anything that they want to be. They weren't created for the streets. They weren't created for a life of exploitation. So when that exploiter comes along, they can say, you know what, I have other choices, I have other options, and they can go the other way and realize there's some other things that they can do. One of the organizations that we are really excited to work with is Bethany Christian Services. They are a national organization. They're kind of what I call the pre-prevention. They work with a family before that family or single parent is in crisis, which I think is so important. And it's a great opportunity for the church to get involved in. With Bethany Christian Services, they background check and they train Christian homes to be a temporary home for a parent whose life is in crisis, or maybe who just needs a temporary place for their child to go in case if they just maybe recently got a job and have to go out of town for job training. And at the same time, that parent never relinquishes their parental rights. DFACS is never involved, but it just allows that parent to know that their child is in a safe environment. And then at the end of the day, when that parent is able to come back and take control of their child and bring the child back into their home, then they can go ahead and regain, pick up their child and take the child back into their home. It's great because why do we have to wait until a family's life is bottomed out and the family's life is in crisis? So Bethany has a great model in place where they're doing kind of that pre-prevention of a child being at risk. Mentoring organizations such as the Rock of the Escape, they work with boys. And working with boys, I think, is huge. Boys are what I call the triple threat. They can grow up to be pimp, predator, but boys are also something that can happen to them is they can be just as exploited as girls. And people tend to forget that. They can be a victim themselves. And so we have to mentor boys. We have to give boys a solid foundation and help them understand who they are as young men. But we also have to have men that are willing to step into the arena and mentor young boys. We work with Wellspring Living for Girls, which is a restorative home for girls 17 and under here in Atlanta. And we're thankful that we have Wellspring Living for Girls because once a child is rescued, what we need to make sure is that they have a place to go where they are safe, they're secure, they can get the mental health services that they need, the restorative services in all capacities. From a wraparound standpoint, they can get back on track academically from school, and Wellspring has all of that. And so they've had a great success rate. They've had girls that have graduated and gone on to college, and they've regained control of their lives. And I think that's what's important, is that to know that these young girls, they have value and they have worth, and that's what we can't lose sight of. We get together as those that love Jesus Christ and serve Him for the benefit of the children. And we talk about these children together because everybody has something they can bring to the table. They have their talents, their time, their resources, and they also have their connections. And so what we have found is that when you come to a Street Grace meeting, when you come to hear about this issue, you can work together, and you might say, you know, I can only do this much, but you might know somebody who you can connect with, a community partner. You might know somebody who you can connect with another organization. And as we connect the community partners together that are working with the at-risk children, as we connect the volunteers with the community partners, it becomes this interwoven tapestry.
If you're a pastor, why not do what Reverend Weimer did in Atlanta and gather community leaders together to pray about what you can do together as the body of Christ? And if you're a housewife like Amy, why not get in your pastor's face and let him know how important it is that something be done to rescue these modern-day child slaves whose lives can only be described as a living hell? I know you'll do the right thing. So let's link arms together and unite as one, even as our Lord and Father are one. I'm Stacia Freeman for Pure Passion.